So welcome friends, what if Naruto was used Orochimaru memories to ruin Luo BingGe? It was a bit like having his head cracked open like an egg. Though less of the physical sensation and more something vaguely similar to settling in a new host. Except where there should be a faded resignation and despair, suffocated under the weight of the technique, it almost felt as if he was experiencing it from both angles at the same time. It was in fact very unpleasant, and Orochimaru no, Shenju no. He wasn't going to have an identity crisis on top of the migraine from hell. He reached inside of himself for chakra and found Kai condensed into a fragile golden core. Satisfied with this clear proof of who he was, Shenju tried to make sense of what had happened. He'd been meditating with his regular incense no. It'd smelled different. A faulty incense stick. Sabotage. Poison. Regardless, he'd been meditating and must have suffered a Kai deviation. Possibly because of the incense, possibly because he was simply naturally prone to them. The Kai deviation must have been bad, but instead of killing him, it seemed to have. Oh. Shenju's life was so horrible because karma was real. Wow. Alright. Note to self, don't engage in human experimentation and wanton murder. He thought he'd gotten away clean after the goddess descended from the moon, and everyone decided that they were friends now actually, but apparently karma hadn't agreed. Bummer. Suppressing the weird dissonance of academic curiosity and some disturbingly well-preserved memories of exactly how horrible Shenju's life was, Shenju finally opened his eyes. And immediately closed them again. Bright. Xiaoju. A flash of memory of a twisted and revolting man, leaning over him with a hazy kind of lustful greed. Don't call me that. His voice was hoarse, but then he'd probably been out of it for a while if Yu Qingjuan had made it to his bedside. Also, he might have been screaming during the Kai deviation. That happens sometimes. There was a pause that was probably relieved since that was a pretty standard response from Shenju. Though that wasn't necessarily a good thing. You'd think that Yu Qingjuan would listen one of these days. Shen Shidi, how are you feeling? Like he'd been fighting a Biju whilst hungover and then somebody possibly Tsunade had been using his skull like a drum. Headache. It wasn't like he could hide that one, but Shenju wasn't in the habit of admitting to weaknesses that could be used against him, so that was all that he was going to give. How proud Yu Qingjuan must be to be trusted to at least not actively raise his voice just to hurt this vulnerable Shidi further. That put him roughly at the same level as Mu Qingfang, an actual healer who'd probably be trying to help. Shenju trusted Mu Qingfang about as far as he could throw him, and that wasn't only because he was a man. There's an old saying about the difference between a healer and a poisoner was largely a matter of differencing ideologies. And, since Shenju couldn't read the man's mind, he wasn't entirely sure that that difference applied. Was it paranoid? Yes. Was it foolish to not trust his own fellow peak lords? Not at all. They'd all proven themselves to be selfish entitled bastards on one level or another, and Shenju wasn't ever going to expose his back to them if he could help it. Was it hypocritical of Shenju to call them selfish bastards when he himself had grown up as a selfish slave, desperately fighting for survival? Was it hypocritical to do so when he could remember doing horrible things simply because of orders and then continuing to do horrible things purely out of his own personal academical curiosity? Sure. Shenju didn't claim to be some kind of saint. But he also didn't spread unsubstantiated rumors based on conjecture unless he was actively trying to ruin someone's reputation. He also didn't burst into a place of work, destroy furniture, harass the staff, and then loudly start shouting and condemning one of the customers for being a horrible person for indulging. Shenju didn't have any interest for indulging in the first place. He hadn't had those urges as Orochimaru, and he couldn't remember having had them prior to Kyujianlo. And at this point, the idea of being intimate with someone in such a manner. He'd honestly rather drink acid. But even if he had been indulging, that wouldn't have been any business of Liu Qingge. The Qingjing cultivation style didn't have abstinence included anywhere, and what Shenju did during his personal free time was nobody's business but his own. The fact that Liu Qingge had broken into the brothel in order to lecture him about it. That he'd also loudly proclaimed that this was why Shenju's cultivation was so lackluster to the world at large, despite clearly knowing absolutely nothing about anything. Shenju very much didn't like Liu Qingge. Orochimaru would have probably let him get himself stabbed in the back that time, instead of rescuing him. Insufferable idiot. Still, had Liu Qingge decided to apologize for things said and done during his foolish youth, upon ascending into becoming a peak lord, then Shenju would have probably forgiven him. Shenju had after all done plenty of things that he wasn't proud of himself, and seeing Liu Qingge bow his head would likely have been very cathartic. But that hadn't happened. No, what had happened instead was that Liu Qingge had been chosen as a peak lord, hadn't changed his attitude or disposition at all, had continued to arbitrarily start trying to lecture Shenju, and continued to be backed up by every other peak lord. Liu Qingge can do no wrong. He's so talented and beautiful and from a noble lineage. The one in the wrong must be dirty spoiled Shen Qingqiu, who probably only got his position through some kind of blackmail. Shen Ju opened his eyes again to stare at the ceiling. Yeah, okay. His head was a mess. Too many memories knocked loose, bouncing around and triggering emotional responses that he really shouldn't be bothering with. Liu Qingge was a spoiled brat. Orochimaru had seen the type hundreds of times. Usually right before he killed them for getting in his way. The idea of running Liu Qingge through with Shuyu was vaguely entertaining, but the cultivation world was a lot less forgiving of murder than shinobi were. He didn't particularly fancy the idea of spending his life on the run just because it'd be satisfying to get rid of a nuisance. No, if he killed him off, he'd have to find some way to frame the man's death as an accident. Or he could frame him for a crime he didn't commit and watch him be executed. That could be funny in an ironic kind of way. Still, that was a thought for another day. Shen Ju started pushing himself up to a seated position, despite Yu Qingjuan's protests about waiting from Yu Qingfang and not moving so much. Shen Ju patiently waited for Yu Qingjuan to get it all out of his system. The man was going to fuss for however long it took him to convince himself that Shen Ju had fully recovered. Whether that would be an hour from now or next week was anyone's guess. He was still dealing with that mess and trying to sort out his jumbled memories when Luo Bing showed up at his doorstep. Luo Bing, his most uppity disciple. The disciple who'd sometimes look at him with avaricious eyes that definitely didn't belong to someone innocent. The disciple who would have had reasonably easy access to Shen Ju's incense. This lowly disciple heard that Shizen had been hurt. This master thanks Luo Bing for his concern, but surely he has actual duties to attend to. There. The slightest narrowing of the eyes, a tightening of the lips. Disappointment. An angry kind of frustration. At being called out for skipping chores again. Possibly. At failing to achieve what he'd been hoping to achieve with that enforced Kai deviation. Also possibly. Either way, the sudden showcasing of concern from Luo Bing was uncharacteristic. And that combined with him skipping chores in order to check up on him, yes. This was definitely the prime suspect. Shen Ju wasn't sure what he'd been hoping to achieve with it. To ruin Shen Ju's cultivation as a way to humiliate him. To kill him. Too. That avarice. The familiar greed. The fact that this Kai deviation somehow managed to push him far enough that his memories jumbled with the ones of his past life. That Luo Bing forced a Kai deviation on his Shizen in order to mess with his mind and take advantage of him. Shen Ju kept his face perfectly blank, even as a part of him suddenly wanted Luo Bing very dead. Immediately. This disciple has finished his chores, Luo Bing protested. And your studies? Shen Ju was satisfied with how the detached politeness in his voice didn't waver. Luo Bing caught himself before his face could contort as if he was drinking vinegar. Truly, a disciple dedicated to learning how to cultivate. He should never have picked him up. Especially if this was how the little beast decided to repay him. Regular insubordination and now escalating into what could easily classify as a murder attempt. Luo Bing is dismissed. This master needs his rest. Luo Bing retreated. Still trying to play at the role of an obedient disciple despite his twisted nature. Leaving Shen Ju behind to deal with Yu Qingjuan's fussy doting. As if Shen Ju was an invalid just because he had a headache. The headache and a sudden need to wash himself until the feeling of those greedy eyes on his skin disappeared. Karma was the worst. XXX. It took Shen Ju about 5 minutes after meeting him again to figure out why Liu Qingge was so upset with him about his visits to brothels. But, considering that the man was about as delicate as a scalpel the size of Bijou, he also realized that Liu Qingge had no idea. This shitey had a crush on him and wanted him to not look at others. Wanted him to not stray. And since the idiot didn't have even the most basics of grasps of normal human emotions, he made up a lot of excuses about it. Honestly, he reminded him a lot of Jiraiya. Less with the peeking on bathing women and more with some of the trends in his writing that had been pointed out to him after the man's death. Some minor anecdotes that Orochimaru had taken a lot of delight in torturing the Rakudame Hokage with. Things like how on multiple occasions the hero would be faced with a choice between a sexy blonde with amazing breasts and a quietly stoic dark-haired woman who didn't have nearly the curves to compete. And then pick the dark-haired one. Orochimaru didn't quite know what to think about the possibility that his old teammate had a terrible childhood crush on him that he'd completely failed to realize simply because he loved women. And that this expressed itself with Orochimaru's female mirror image stealing the hearts of so many of Jiraiya's heroes. On one hand, it was greatly entertaining to mess with people's perception of the books and Jiraiya's supposed love of women. On the other hand, it was sad to realize that he'd never be able to mock Jiraiya about it nor ask Tsunade about it. Perhaps it was simply a wistful kind of feeling for a time that never came to pass. Orochimaru would have obviously rejected him if he'd actually confessed, but that was more because the idea of having sex would have probably just convinced Orochimaru to invent some kind of sex genjutsu that he could send Jiraiya's way so that he'd leave him alone. He'd never been terribly interested in the pleasures of flesh. Would he have played it up and worn sexy outfits just to mess with Jiraiya's head? Oh, absolutely. But that was because Orochimaru very much enjoyed messing with people. In the end, whether Jiraiya's feelings were romantic or if he'd simply developed such a fixation on him over the years of trying to track him down that it was partially reflected in his books. It didn't actually matter. The life that had happened. Still, seeing that same kind of fixated obliviousness now displayed so openly by Liu Qingyi he would have liked to say that it was flattering, but honestly, it was mostly just annoying. He wasn't going to be Liu Qingyi's punching bag just because the man was incapable of realizing that the reason he was so enthusiastic about tracking him down was that he desperately wanted Shen Ju to pay attention to him. If the man wanted to court him, he could damn well actually go through the motion and court him instead of trying to pull on his pigtails. Shen Ju would still reject him of course because he had no interest in a relationship like that. But he would have rejected him cordially, with respect and sympathy, as befitting an ally and possible friend. As it was, he was sincerely tempted to start some kind of rumor about Liu Qingyi ambushing him in the bath to a swords duel and Shen Ju having to escape with his precious modesty intact. The rumor obviously wouldn't stick since everyone already knew that Shen Ju was a terrible lecher and that Liu Qingyi was far too honorable to ambush anyone, especially in the bath. But that was about the level of antipathy that Shen Ju was feeling towards him. He supposed that he could maybe find something else to use to slander the man in front of the rumor mill, but he honestly couldn't be bothered. Trying to plant a rumor was always a pain in the neck and that would surely be exponentially increased when trying to slander a well-respected figure when he himself was a not respected figure. Not to mention the risks of having someone backtrack the rumor and finding Shen Ju as the instigator. No, it just wasn't worth the hassle. Still, facing Liu Qingyi in a spar would be good. Shen Ju was still Shen Ju, with his crippled cultivation and lackluster strength. But Orochimaru hadn't needed Tsunade's infamous strength to go toe-to-toe with Bijuu, and he was technically a swordsman. Shuyu wasn't Kusanagi, and Shen Ju didn't have any techniques for turning his tongue into a limb of its own, but a mostly friendly spar might do a lot to see how his combat abilities might have been affected by his new memories. So he agreed. Liu Qingyi was fast. And strong. And at least reasonably skilled with the blade. Shen Ju's body felt heavy and stiff, his mind trying to tell him that he could simply bend away from attacks that he logically wouldn't be able to bend away from without turning his bones as flexible as rubber. Shuya was a lot more attentive than Kusanagi had ever been, responding to his will in a way that guided him away from attacks that he would never have been able to weather. Liu Qingyi was strong. But he was also so blatantly predictable. Shen Ju stepped aside of a strike that might as well have been telegraphed, Shuya-rising to deflect Liu Qingyi's blade, a simple strike to the nerve clusters in Liu Qingyi's wrist with his offhand, a hissed breath, but the sword turned nimbly and Shen Ju was forced to retreat away instead of disarming him properly. Spirit swords were an interesting challenge to work with. Underhanded Liu Qingyi hissed. The hidden enemy in front of me? Shen Ju smiled, slow and cruel. Indeed, the height of dishonor is to fight back. Liu Qingyi growled at him before launching himself back into the fight, sword held high. So telegraphed. And again, perhaps it was unfair to compare the fighting style of a man who regularly fought animalistic monsters to the fighting style of the thousands of people trained to kill fellow ninja that Orochimaru had carved through like a warm knife through butter. Humans were very different from animals, no matter how dangerous those animals might be. And a fighting style that worked on one might not translate well towards another. In that sense, had this been a contest to see how many monsters they could slay, Shen Ju would have been hopelessly outclassed. But in a face-to-face spar, the difference in their levels of experience was severe. Shen Ju doubted that he'd manage anything more than a draw. Not with how instinctively Liu Qingyi moved. Sooner or later he'd start to predict the moves that Shen Ju performed in order to dodge his telegraphed attacks, and then his greater speed and strength, as well as stamina, would inevitably lead him to victory. And Shen Ju doubted that he'd be able to defeat Liu Qingyi before then. No, rather than trying to win, a better strategy would be to find a way to interrupt the match before it reached that point. Shen Ju sent a knee into Liu Qingyi's crotch, still trying to find a good spot to. Liu Qingyi was wheezing on the ground. Shen Ju paused, honestly bewildered as he stared down at the man. He was curled around himself, as if trying to protect himself from further hits, and his sword was forgotten on the ground. What in the world? Dishonorable bastard, Liu Qingyi wheezed through gritted teeth and what might be tears. Aim for the only head you seem capable of thinking with? Shen Ju couldn't help but ask. There were gasps from the gathered crowd. most of them sounding very scandalized. Kids these days. Didn't anyone teach them how to trash talk during fights? I'm not you. Luo BingGe exclaimed in a rage, unfurling from his position on the ground but clearly unable to put any kind of weight on his legs. Clearly. If you were, you would have been long dead by now. Shen Ju agreed. I've seen less predictable street rats. Luo BingGe's face had mostly recovered from the pale greenish pallor he'd been and instead shifted into an angry red. You. But as you can't seem to move, I believe that this is the end of our spar. Shen Ju smiled at him, all sharp teeth. Or do you intend to fight me whilst crawling in the dirt like a worm? XXX. This is highly inappropriate, Shen Shidi. Liu Qingfang was frowning at him. Several of the other peak lords who were gathered around the meeting room table nodded, though from the glances that Kai Qingqi kept sending towards Luo BingGe and the small twitches of her lips, she probably also considered it very funny. The spar. Shen Ju raised an eyebrow at the healer. I believe that I was cleared for regular exercise, was I not? That's not the problem and you know it. Liu Qingfang snapped back. Shen Ju knew exactly what he was talking about, but the warped view these people had about proper behavior was ridiculous. In a battle, the only thing that mattered was surviving. Everything else was purely secondary. Unless you were an idiot who believed that your death could somehow help with accomplishing the mission. Orochimaru didn't mind those people existing because they were easy to use and manipulate into wanting to die for the sake of Orochimaru's convenience. But a spade was a spade and deserved to be addressed as such. Is sparring not a way to learn from one another? Shen Ju asked. The groin has several major arteries as well as sensitive nerve clusters. Leaving all of these weaknesses undefended will inevitably lead someone to take advantage of them. Should I then not attempt to aid in my Shidi's future survival by teaching him to defend such a vulnerable area? Luo BingGe leaped to his feet, red in the face. Enough. Liu Qingju barked. Luo BingGe hesitated but sat back down. Shen Shidi, such attacks are dishonorable and should not be displayed within full view of our disciples. Especially not in a friendly spar. Liu Qingju continued. Ah yes. Defeating the war god of Baijian with a single hit and leaving him pathetically crawling in the dirt in front of a full audience of onlookers. That wasn't exactly a good look for Kang Kyung's martial peak. Even the sect as a whole might take a hit to their reputation since their supposed strongest martial cultivator was brought so low by a single hit. In light of that, Shen Ju could accept that the other peak lords would be upset with him. However, Shen Ju was also firmly of the opinion that if their reputation relied on an idiot who couldn't even defend his groin from a knee that had been intended to do little more than distract, then that reputation was unearned and they would have inevitably lost it regardless. Shen Ju inclined his head. This master shall endeavor to not humiliate his Shidi with his blatant weaknesses in the future. Liu BingGe shot to his feet again. You dishonorable bastard. The meeting honestly degenerated from there, with insults being slung by most everyone with a pair of lips and a tongue. It was honestly the most productive peak lord meeting in months. XXX. Of course Shen Ju investigated Luo Bing. Unfortunately, there wasn't a lot that he could do on that front without rousing suspicion. The incense that had likely been sabotaged had been long since removed by the time that Shen Ju was allowed to return to his bamboo house. It was in fact rather likely that it had been removed whilst everyone else had been focused on keeping him alive after such a significant Kai deviation. That left going through the boy's personal effects, but that wasn't the kind of thing that Shen Ju could justify without a reason. So he had to be very stealthy about it. It wasn't hard to find a time when Luo Bing would either be too busy with lessons or chores to interrupt him, and not leaving evidence behind was rather pathetically easy. However, outside of a blatantly faulty cultivation manual that Shen Ju certainly hadn't given the boy, there was nothing of note. Which was why he'd decided to ambush Ming Fan about the cultivation manual. It stood to reason that the boy must have been given it by someone, and since Shen Ju wasn't the one responsible for it, his head disciple was the most likely culprit. Ming Fan, what has this master taught you about breaking rules? Ming Fan blinked at him, confused. That this disciple shouldn't do it. Shen Ju raised an eyebrow at him. The actual lesson, Ming Fan. Ming Fan blushed, but hurriedly straightened. To not get caught, shizen. Shen Ju nodded. And does Ming Fan understand what this entails? Ming Fan thought about it for a moment. To not break the rules in front of witnesses or to otherwise leave behind evidence of this one's wrongdoing. Good. That Ming Fan knows this is good. Shen Ju smiled indulgently at the boy before letting that smile rapidly slide off his face. So why is Ming Fan attempting to set himself up for attempted murder on his Shidi? All of the color drained out of Ming Fan's face. And murder. Shen Ju had to take a moment to stare at the boy. Surely he wasn't that dumb. Surely him being the brightest disciple on the scholarly peak was not because the bar was set so pathetically low. Ming Fan is aware of what Kai deviation can do to a cultivator. That it's likely to cripple and entirely capable of killing the cultivator. Shen Zhu hinted, a bit disbelieving. Ming Fan frowned, clearly confused. Yes. This disciple understands the dangers of Kai deviations. And Ming Fan is aware of how faulty cultivation will inevitably lead to those exact Kai deviations. Shen Zhu continued to hint, beginning to lose all hope for the intelligence of any of his students. Ming Fan nodded, but still looked confused. Yes, Shizen. So then, does it not stand to reason that any Kai deviation that a disciple suffers would be investigated to determine the cause of it? To make certain that they had not been trying to cultivate in an inappropriate manner. If nothing else, then to make certain that future disciples know not to follow in their footsteps. Ming Fan nodded. Then the color drained right out of his face again, as finally realization seemed to hit him. Shen Zhu smiled at him, amused at his suffering. Indeed, Ming Fan. To give a fellow disciple a faulty or incomplete cultivation manual can be considered to be a murder attempt on that disciple. That was never my intention, Shizen. Ming Fan hurried to declare. Oh? Shen Zhu raised an eyebrow again. Then why have you been leaving evidence of such misconduct behind? This lowly disciple only wanted Ning Shimei to stop paying attention to Luo Shidi. I didn't intend to kill him. Ming Fan nearly looked to be on the verge of tears. Pathetic. Why did he ever bother teaching these disciples anything if this was the best one of the bunch? Ignoring how he was suddenly backing away from even the thought of murder as if it was poison on his tongue, his method of achieving his supposed goal was so incompetent that Shen Zhu honestly considered tossing him off a cliff and finding a better disciple somewhere else. Shen Zhu stared at the sniveling boy, he really had started crying. Yuck. Is Ming Fan unaware of the basic personality of the target of his affection? He couldn't help but ask. Ning Yinjing has never made a secret of how she enjoys to help. Making it more difficult for Luo Bing would inevitably make him more in need of help, which Ning Yinjing would continue trying to give to him. Ming Fan stared up at him with wet eyes, a horrified look on his face. This disciple didn't know. Could Shen Zhu simply accuse the idiot of attempted murder of a Shidi and then get rid of him? Probably. But then he'd have to find a new head disciple, and he'd have to make sure that they knew how to do the paperwork properly, and considering how far Ming Fan's abilities put him above the rest of his peers, the only viable candidate would probably be Luo Bing. Unfortunately, Luo Bing's only claim to the title of most competent disciple was the fact that he'd nearly managed to kill his Shizen. And considering how murder didn't actually seem to be the brat's actual goal with that scheme, Shen Zhu was hesitant to classify him as competent. The fact that Luo Bing was also someone that Shen Zhu didn't want to be in the same room as unless the brat was a decapitated corpse certainly didn't help matters. No, Ming Fan was truly his only option for a head disciple, even if he was so incompetent that Shen Zhu was sincerely considering just lighting him on fire. XXX. Luo Bing had tried so hard. He'd behaved just like that other version of himself, a clingy crybaby who just wanted to spend time with his precious Shizen. But instead of being granted a nice and indulgent Shizen, he'd still been stuck with the same venomous bastard that had always been his Shizen. Finally, he'd come up with a plan to force the man into a Kai deviation that would wipe his memories clean. He knew perfectly well how very pliant people became when you could convince them that something was normal. Yes, it was a perfect plan. And he'd made sure that the Kai deviation wouldn't get so bad as to actually kill his Shizen. He'd even made sure to clear up any traces of the incense he'd used because he wasn't a fool. Except, Shizen didn't become confused and pliant. He was still the same cold-hearted Shizen. Luo Bing wanted to wring his beautiful neck. Ah, but how beautiful he'd look when he squirmed, trying desperately to breathe and slowly growing ever more pale. And then he could sink his teeth into that pale skin and feed him his blood and bring him back to life so that he could do it again and again and again. Luo Bing was frustrated. He hadn't exactly been planning to go back in time like this, but it was honestly perfect. Or it should have been. He'd done everything right, so why didn't he have a sweet and kind-hearted Shizen? Why did only that weak crybaby version of him have such a perfect Shizen? No, instead of Shizen becoming kind, suddenly Ming Fan showed up and gave him a proper cultivation manual. The boy claimed that it was a mistake, that Luo Bing had been given a faulty manual out of mistake, and that Ming Fan had only realized when he'd gone looking for that faulty manual and realized that it wasn't where he'd left it. It was a blatant excuse. Everyone knew that Ming Fan was lying out of his ass about giving it to Luo Bing by accident. But the boy did seem regretful about it for some reason. Regardless, Luo Bing had no interest in Ming Fan. He'd killed the boy once, and he didn't particularly mind doing it again, but he wasn't going to jeopardize his plans for his Shizen for something as irrelevant as that. No, he'd have his perfect and nice Shizen, no matter what. XXX. Meditating was different. It wasn't that Shen Zhu had suddenly solidified his cultivation and overcome his current bottleneck. It was more that heart demons that had once plagued him now oftentimes felt very distant. His cultivation was still crippled from his early life and he was unlikely to overcome his current bottleneck anytime soon, but there was a level of tranquility in meditating that he hadn't quite felt before. Shenju was still Shenju, but with decades spent being Orochimaru crammed into his head, it gave him perspective. Orochimaru had started his life desperate. Desperate for people who loved him, desperate for acknowledgement, desperate for a way to have his loved ones returned to him. Before being ground down underneath Konoha's war machine and the endless bloodshed and horrors that he was expected to commit. By the time he defected from Konoha, Orochimaru was a monster who'd completely forgotten what it meant to be human. And he'd hated all of them for that, but he'd hated the people who'd promised him love and care the most. Life as a missing nin hadn't exactly helped matters, letting him slip into all of the horrors he'd only been able to conceive of and was now capable of performing. After all, he was already a horrible monster, why shouldn't he just continue down that path? And then Uchiha Sasuke arrived at his doorstep. A little bit too late for Orochimaru to take him as his new body. And so Orochimaru had trained him, had tried to. Sasuke was a genius and wholly dedicated to avenging his clan. But there was steel in his spine, and no matter what training exercise Orochimaru placed in front of him, he continued to refuse to kill. A missing nin who defected into the welcoming arms of a man who'd killed his cage, but who kept a stricter moral code than most village-bound ninja. Oh, Orochimaru had still been planning on using him as a convenient host, right up until the little bastard killed him. Or mostly killed him, as it was. But there was a reason that in the end he'd been willing to step away from his role as a monster in order to aid humanity against their greatest foe yet. There was a reason that he'd effectively retired. At some point, Sasuke had infected him with humanity once again. And instead of living on out of spite towards all who'd hurt him, instead of living on purely out of desperation and fear, he'd found a genuine kind of joy in life. For Shenju, who'd spent his life desperately grasping for power, for control, for something that would stop his loved ones from slipping through his fingers like sand. For Shenju, the idea that there was happiness to be found in simply drinking tea on his lonesome, in watching the sun rise and set, in trying to count the stars simply because he didn't have anything more important to be doing. It was different. He was different. Shenju was still Shenju, he cared about what he'd always cared about. But with Orochimaru's memories leaning over his shoulder, there was a visceral kind of understanding that those things only mattered to Shenju because he wanted them to matter. He cared about Kangkyong because it was a beautiful place, with wonderful libraries, and Kaiji was here. He cared about Kangkyong for those reasons, but there were plenty of beautiful places in the world, and a library was something that he could gather for himself if he set his mind to it. Even Kaiji wasn't that important in the grand scheme of things. Orochimaru had cared deeply about a lot of people, and he'd parted ways with them and still managed to live a happy, fulfilling life. Shenju didn't want to lose Yu Kinjuan, but it was a hit that he knew that he could survive. Not comfortably, perhaps, and he'd likely murder whoever or whatever was responsible for it. But the sun still rose, the plants still grew, the birds were still making their nests, life moved on, and Shenju would too. That said, he didn't really have any desire to pick up his life where Orochimaru had left off. But there was a tranquil kind of reassurance that, no matter what horrors happened around him, Shenju could still find happiness in this world. So meditating was different now. And Shenju doubted that he'd be as prone to Kai deviations as he'd been before. XXX. Shenju wasn't sure what to make of his disciples. On the one hand, they were all gibbering buffoons, and he'd probably be better off throwing them off of his peak and then grabbing some random street kid and declaring them his new heir. On the other hand, he'd already invested a bunch of time into trying to teach them cultivation and really wasn't in the mood to go roaming through alleyways looking for someone with a smidgen of talent. The sunk cost fallacy. Better to make sure that his previous shitty investment paid off at least a little than go gambling on another option somehow making up the difference. Also, if he started throwing disciples off of his peak, everyone would start yelling him about it. And that would be annoying. Still, the fact that Ming Fan had been so blindsided by his own self-plotted attempted murder was enough for Shenju to decide that something would have to be done about it. Letting things continue as they were would just be too humiliating for words if one of his disciples actually managed to go through with it only to be immediately caught. So, Shenju set up a few lectures about basic investigation. Of course, he phrased it more as things that should be done in case foul play was suspected. Whether it be on missions or elsewhere. Investigate the victim's possession, interview nearby people, check to see if the victim was part of a pattern, investigate the body for clues as to exactly how they died and why. If someone was stabbed in the back and had their money pouch removed, then money might have been a factor in why they were killed. But if they were also wearing valuable jewelry that weren't stolen, then perhaps someone was simply trying to make it seem as if a bandit had attacked. Basic stuff. He also briefly mentioned Kai deviations and how it was important to investigate why one had happened. both to capture a potential culprit but also for more mundane reasons, such as making sure that whatever mistake might have led to such a thing was caught early in future students. There was of course the risk that Luo Bing would learn a lot from the lectures and become even more difficult to catch in the future, but Shen Ju honestly doubted that it would come to that. Luo Bing was arrogant. Oh, he kowtowed to his utmost abilities and played up the weepy act. But there was a certainty in his eyes that said that he was simply better than his peers. That he was a once-in-a-lifetime genius and that he needed to pretend at incompetence in order to not be immediately spotted as a blatant anomaly. He wasn't wrong, but that kind of attitude didn't really lend itself to actual humility. Luo Bing had forced a Kai deviation on his own Shizen and he hadn't been caught. He hadn't achieved his desired goal, but he hadn't been punished for attempting it. As far as Luo Bing was concerned, he just needed to lay low for a while and then strike again when Shen Ju let his guard down. Let enough time pass that people didn't think too much about a second serious Kai deviation, since Shen Ju was after all so very prone to them. In other words, Luo Bing had already gotten away with his attempted murder once, so all he really needed to do was set it up so that the situation was the same as the first one. And then he'd get away with it a second time, easy as that. Orochimaru had seen plenty of child geniuses fall into the same trap. Of not really acknowledging that a stray shot from even an incompetent moron could kill. That no situation was ever the same as last time. Life was so shock-filled with variables that the only real way to plan for it was to consider every mission as a wholly unique thing. Because the moment you allowed yourself to fall into the regular mission mindset, your brain would start planning out exactly what it expected you to see. And then it would show that to you. This was why Jinjutsu that simply showed success was honestly some of the most efficient Jinjutsu out there. Unless the victim was painfully aware of how outgunned they were or had lived through enough failures that a success would feel strange, their brain would simply refuse to show them all of the inconsistencies. And then they'd be dead. Orochimaru had never been overly fond of the stuff, but he had toyed with it whilst poking around in human brains for well over a decade. And that was without mentioning how he'd seen it happen time and time again. Ninja were ruthlessly trained to always expect enemy ninja to jump out from behind a corner because anything less would have their brains classify those corners as irrelevant and that would get them killed. But that didn't account for the more esoteric of abilities that said ninja might come across. Why would bugs be considered dangerous to anyone who hadn't met an Abiram? Why would a hissing noise be dangerous if the person didn't know about explosive notes? Luo Bing had the skill, the talent, to effortlessly coast ahead of his fellows. But he didn't have the mindset necessary to avoid using a method that had already proven that it worked. So Shen Ju wasn't overly concerned. He kept an eye on the boy because Shen Ju had lived his life on the street where any corner could be an ambush and Orochimaru had lived through more wars than his current disciples knew how to count to. But no, Luo Bing would be making his move in due time. Shen Ju would just need to catch him. Somehow. Preferably red-handed enough that even his fellow peak lords couldn't claim that Shen Ju was just lying about the whole thing. He might be able to get Yu Qingjuan to come down on his side, but the man often tended to treat Shen Ju more as an unruly toddler than a person with a brain. So having clear proof would be important because he wouldn't get a second chance at that. After all, if his first accusation was dismissed, then his second one would obviously just be him fabricating the evidence himself. And that would make them even less likely to believe him. XXX. Yu Qingge continued to be a nuisance. In the aftermath of Shen Ju's dishonorable attack on the man's future children, heaven save them from inheriting the man's brain, Liu Qingge made it a point to seek out Shen Ju, even when he was safely ensconced on his own peak. Liu Qingge wanted a rematch. And after flinging a few more insults at the annoying man, only to have him keep showing up demanding another spar, Shen Ju gave it to him. And Liu Qingge was so focused on where Shen Ju's knees were that he didn't even notice Shen Ju clapping the man over the ear, rupturing his eardrum, and leaving him staggering under the force of his sudden motion sickness. The very bitter part of Shen Ju was very upset with Liu Qingge because of it. Both for being lauded as a battle god despite his clear inability to survive an actual fight and because prior to his memories as Orochimaru returning to him, he hadn't actually been able to beat the moron. There are few things that are quite so humiliating as realizing that the person that had been defeating you was an incompetent buffoon. Shen Ju channeled that annoyance into making a few more mean comments at Liu Qingge as he tried to continue fighting despite his injury. Shen Ju also made sure to keep his distance because grappling range would largely negate the man's sudden balance issues, which finally resulted in Liu Qingge once again crawling in the dirt, shouting about Shen Ju's dishonorable conduct. This master doesn't quite see why his Shide's own incompetence should reflect badly on the nature of this master. Shen Ju pointed out, safely out of reach of the man's sword, which he was still swinging around wildly. which set off another rant about Shen Ju's rotten nature and convinced Shen Ju to simply tell one of the disciples to wait until he stopped swinging the sword around and then carry the man off to Qian Kao. Then Shen Ju turned on his heel and walked off. If Liu Qingyi wanted to rant about his supposed parentage, he could at least do the damn research and find out that Shen Ju was a street rat and an orphan. What a pathetic waste of what was likely a perfectly functional biological brain. Shen Ju had more important things to do with his life than listening to the inane rants of a sore loser. XXX. Xiao Ju should apologize to Liu Shidi. A breathless panting in his ear, whispering about the smoothness of his skin. Shen Ju took a deep breath, suppressing the memory and the flash of undiluted rage that came with it. Liu Qingjuan didn't know what that name had become to him, and he didn't deserve having Shen Ju rip out his tongue for speaking it. But he was also not going to apologize to someone for having made it more difficult for them to insult him. If Liu Qingyi wanted nothing to do with Shen Ju and left him alone for the rest of forever, Shen Ju certainly wasn't going to track him down just so that he could continue insulting him. But if the man insisted on ambushing Shen Ju on his own peak to try and force that confrontation, then surely Shen Ju shouldn't be the one being scolded in the aftermath, right? Except he was. He always was. It wouldn't matter what he told Liu Qingjuan or the other peak lords, they'd turn their nose up at him and call him uncouth or dishonorable or even rotten. So, rather than have that argument again, because Shen Ju wasn't going to bow his head and apologize to someone else for them being rude to him, Shen Ju instead decided to change the subject. Liu Qingjuan, do you want to know why I keep telling you not to call me by that name? Shen Ju asked, eyes narrowed and voice deceptively gentle. Liu Qingjuan frowned at him for changing the subject. Xiao Ju will always be Xiao Ju to this Kaiji. Shen Ju's mouth was open, a grand reveal to the horrors he'd suffered at the hands of the Q on the tip of his tongue, but there was ice in his stomach. Orochimaru admitted that he'd failed to keep Tsunade's little brother safe, that he'd failed him as a teacher, that he wasn't even bothered by it because people died all the time, that she should stop crying about it. Orochimaru watching as instead of indignant rage and hate, Tsunade didn't even seem to notice that he was there, as if there was nothing inside of her at all. So hollowed out by her own grief that one of her closest friends who'd admitted to her face that he neglectfully caused her brother's death might as well have been a piece of furniture. Orochimaru watched as his sensei gave the hat to a child rather than risk it landing into the hands of such an unpopular ninja as Orochimaru. Never mind that Orochimaru had contributed extensively to various important parts of keeping Konoha running for decades. Or that making Namikaze the Hokage was a clear provocation towards Iwa, hinting that next time the massacre of their ninja wouldn't stop. Or that Orochimaru would have happily made Namikaze the godame once the villages had stabilized in the aftermath. Or that everyone had been convinced that of course Hiruzen's own student would inherit the hat, just as what had always happened. That even Orochimaru had thought. Orochimaru stared at Hiruzen as the man condemned him for working for a man that Hiruzen himself believed could do no wrong. For helping with a project that Danzo himself oversaw and being blamed for the full extent of the horrors involved. Horrors that amounted to little more than a few dozen unfortunate miscarriages. Orochimaru stared as Hiruzen mercifully allowed him to escape, despite how obvious it was that he was only allowed to run so that he could be turned into a scapegoat to keep Danzo safe and happy. Orochimaru. Shen Ju blinked. For Orochimaru, this feeling of despair and fury was something attached to the greatest betrayals and most painful defeats. For Shen Ju, it was a regular conversation with Liu Qingjuan. This was just how it was. This was just how older brothers were, right? Except that wasn't true. Shen Ju stared at Liu Qingjuan and he knew that it wasn't true. In the eyes of Liu Qingjuan, it truly didn't matter what reason Shen Ju had for anything at all. Whether it be that accursed name or his fights with Liu Qingyi or. In the eyes of Liu Qingjuan, Shen Ju was an inconvenient possession that he was trying to keep on a leash so that it didn't disturb innocent people. Shen Ju was a pet. A misbehaving pet that Liu Qingjuan had to constantly make excuses for. Shen Ju didn't register as a person in his eyes at all. Shen Ju's face smoothed out, a buzzing noise in his ears. Shen Ju turned on his heel and walked away. He had plans to adjust. XXX. Xiao Ju was different since his most recent Kai deviation. Ignoring how he'd actually managed to beat Liu Qingyi, unconventional and inappropriate as it might have been, there was a calm to him that Liu Qingjuan could not recall having ever since on Xiao Ju's face. But that didn't matter, because no matter how much he might change, Xiao Ju was still Xiao Ju. He was still the fiercely loyal boy that Liu Qingjuan had raised, still the same clever soul that would leave everyone else in the dust. And even if there was a thorniness to him that was now also aimed at Liu Qingjuan, it wasn't anything that he didn't deserve. He'd been foolish. So foolish. And Xiao Ju had suffered because of it. How could he explain his foolishness without it sounding like an excuse for something inexcusable? How could he tell him the truth when he knew that Xiao Ju might try to bear the guilt of Liu Qingjuan's horrible mistake? Hadn't Xiaoju suffered enough? No, Yu Qingyuan understood that Xiaoju wanted to leave their shared history behind him, that he wanted nothing to do with Yu Qingyuan, who couldn't uphold his promises. He understood why Xiaoju didn't want him to use that name. But Xiaoju was still Xiaoju, and Yu Qingyuan could never try to erase the truth of their relationship. So he didn't need to listen to Xiaoju telling him that it was a name he left behind, or that Yu Qingyuan had no right to call him that. No matter how painfully truthful those statements might be, Xiaoju will always be Xiaoju to him. His precious Xiaoju. And even if Xiaoju curses at him, that's fine. It's nothing more than what Yu Qingyuan deserves for his foolishness. The sight of Xiaoju pausing right before a new and cutting tirade, of his face turning blank with repressed emotions at Yu Qingyuan's words. He really knew his Xiaoju the best, to be able to turn his wicked tongue speechless with his sincerity. Yu Qingyuan suppressed the urge to smile as Xiaoju beat a rapid retreat, likely trying to hide how moved he was by Yu Qingyuan's words. So cute. Yu Qingyuan only wished that he'd stop causing so much trouble. Xiaoju's precious Kaiji couldn't protect him from everything, after all, and there were consequences for misbehaving in the cultivation world. Dangerous consequences. With Yu Qingyuan removed from Shenju's already sparse list of reasons to stay at Kangqiong, there was a very solid opportunity available for him. He'd been trying to think of a way to catch Luo Bing red-handed with some indisputable proof of his intentions. But if Shenju wasn't planning on sticking around, he didn't actually need to be so worried about it. Mainly because, with Yu Qingyuan's obsessive tendencies, it was obvious that Shenju would never be allowed to simply walk away from Kangqiong. His options were effectively to escape into the night and be forever hunted by Yu Qingyuan and any peak lords he could recruit into helping, or to kill Yu Qingyuan and escape into the night and be forever hunted by the other peak lords for the sake of vengeance, or to fake his own death. One of those options was a lot more feasible than the others. And if Shenju was faking his death, he didn't need to actually catch Luo Bing red-handed, as long as he made sure that the clues surrounding his death led straight to Luo Bing in the aftermath. After all, if an investigation was launched and Luo Bing was found guilty for murdering a peak lord his own Shizen at that, the boy was definitely going to be executed for it. So, all Shenju really needed to do was find a way to fake his own death and then somehow make sure that an investigation was actually launched. The first step was a bit finicky, but Shenju wasn't the peak lord of Qingjing for no reason. He knew plenty of ways to create fake bodies, and though most of those wouldn't hold up to an actual investigation by cultivators, he did have at least one very promising option. The sun and moon dew flower. After all, nobody would be able to classify the body as fake when it was Shenju's actual body that was left dead on the floor. And then Shenju would be reborn into the body that the flower created for him, allowing him to go about his life without any real drawbacks. Well, it wouldn't be his body anymore, but it wouldn't be the first time Orochimaru lived like that, and it had some useful additions. After all, it shouldn't be difficult to modify the flower body enough that Shenju wouldn't actually look like Shenju. It'd be massively inconvenient to go to all of that trouble of faking his own death, only for someone to stumble across him and recognize his face, ruining all of his hard work. That only left actually tracking down the sun and moon dew flower seed, which was not the easiest of tasks, but certainly not impossible. And then all Shenju needed to do was to make sure that Shenju's death was investigated and that all of the clues pointed towards Luo Bing. Considering how Shenju was forcing his students to learn basic forensics and investigation techniques, and that Luo Bing was definitely going to make another attempt at forcing a Kai deviation on Shenju with an incense stick. Honestly, it should be child's play. Provided that none of the people to first arrive on the scene completely ruined everything. Shenju sighed, deciding to create a false diary that he could use to aim a bunch of suspicion towards Luo Bing. Just in case everyone at Kangqiong were simply too stupid to live. Or maybe he could sell the diary as a thing he only created because his perfect memory suddenly started to deteriorate after his most recent Kai deviation. It'd save him the hassle of trying to backdate events for the last couple of decades at least, and it'd explain why he was writing a diary when so many others wouldn't have bothered. A neat solution all around, though if he used it to aim suspicion towards Luo Bing, there was good odds that anyone reading it would simply assume that Shenju was just being overly paranoid because his memory was failing and he wanted someone to blame for it. Thankfully, Yu Qingyuan was an obsessive bastard, and even if the evidence were slim, there was a very real possibility that the rage of having his prized possession stolen from him would stop him from thinking all too critically about it. Between an enraged Yu Qingyuan and a talented but lazy disciple of King Jing, Shenju sincerely doubted that anyone would be able to actually stop Yu Qingyuan before he murdered the boy. It was such a nice feeling, watching a plan come together. XXX. Shenju couldn't exactly rely on a mission taking him in the rough direction of his destination, nor could he trust anyone with what that destination was or why. The first thought was some kind of pretend harvesting mission where Shenju simply claimed that he'd heard of an interesting plant and would be checking it out. But expressing that kind of clear interest could reveal his intentions to someone trying to backtrack his movements after his death, and even if he at this point honestly doubted that anyone in Kangkyong had enough brain cells to rub together between them, he knew better than to take risks. No, he needed a plausible excuse to be in the area. An excuse that would become even more plausible in the aftermath of his death. And wouldn't you know it, there was a certain plant that grew not that far away from his actual goal. A plant that just so happened to when turned into a tea help combat memory loss. Of course, his stated reason for going on a trip wasn't at all related to those plants, but instead an excuse of investigating something from a book. It wouldn't really hold up to scrutiny, but that was sort of the point. Shenju obviously wasn't telling anyone about his deteriorating memory, but it'd be blatantly obvious what his supposed actual goal with his trip was. Especially since he'd be able to bring back those plants and start brewing them into teas. Anyone digging through his belongings in his house would easily stumble across them and be able to draw exactly the kind of conclusions about Shenju's motives that Shenju wanted them to draw. The good secret was one hidden by a much more plausible secret. It still took some doing to find a reasonable time to leave the mountain, since his disciples continued to be laughably incompetent and Liu Qingyi was still on the warpath. Contrary to Shenju's belief when they'd first crossed blades after his Kai deviation, Liu Qingyi hadn't actually adapted to Shenju's fighting style at all. As in, at all. Shenju had kneed him in the groin 3 times now, each time with the exact same result. Oh, the man would be a lot warier about protecting his groin in the immediate aftermath of one of their spars, but then Shenju would do something else underhanded and he'd seemingly forget all about the risks for groin attacks. It was ridiculous. Did the Baijian cultivation style include scooping out the cultivator's brain and putting it in a jar somewhere where it wouldn't get in the way? Surely the man couldn't be so breathtakingly stupid without some kind of third-party interference. Regardless, Liu Qingyi was still just as offended to lose to Shenju's dirty tactics. Tactics that included everything from groin attacks, hits to nerve clusters, sand that was kicked up into the man's eyes, deflecting his sword strikes, instead of trying to block them fully like an idiot, and one memorable occasion of tripping him with a bit of string. Specifically, Liu Qingyi had ambushed him when he'd been teaching his disciples some embroidery techniques, and with a technique that borrowed heavily from a shinobi puppeteer's chakra strings, Shenju had sent the man straight into the dirt. He then continued his lesson, scolding his students for being distracted by the wind whenever they glanced too often at Liu Qingyi's still prone form. Acupuncture was a fascinating subject and Shenju didn't mind sacrificing a few sewing needles in order to demonstrate its effectiveness. Regardless, between teaching, Liu Qingyi's continued harassment and Yu Qinjuan calling meetings in order to publicly scold Shenju for not losing the fights, Shenju had a very busy schedule. Thankfully, since all of his disciples were hopeless idiots anyway, Shenju didn't mind skipping out on a few more of those lessons. Which finally landed him at the edge of Yuanhua territory, in a grotto, in front of a lake that brimmed with spiritual energy and with a snake demon lingering on the edge. Shenju wasn't fond of demons, but there was a certain level of nostalgia with snakes. And the demon had led him to this place, so Shenju didn't mind repaying them. A favor for a favor, he handed the snake demon a few of the seeds and then continued on his own way. It might complicate things if the demon at some point blabbed about Shenju's presence here, but it wasn't like they knew him by name, and the odds of a demon deciding to tell a cultivator anything of importance was roughly slim to none. Doubly so when a favorable transaction had taken place. No, Shenju's secret was safe. Now he just needed to plant the seeds, feed them his Kai, brew some memory-restoring teas, write some incriminating things in a notebook, and then wait for Luo BingGe to sabotage his incense once more. Shenju blinked as he climbed onto his sword, suddenly reminded. Yes, Shuyu would need to be dealt with as well. The spiritual sword would be able to recognize its owner, and it might showcase signs of life that would unravel his ruse. But it wasn't unheard of for one to shatter at the moment of death. He'd just have to break the sword prior to lighting the sabotaged incense. But if he was going for something that dramatic then he might as well go all the way, no. XXX. Everything had been going perfectly. Luo BingGe had managed to slip in another stick of sabotaged incense. This time he'd managed to get his nice shizen for sure. It had been going so smoothly, and Luo BingGe had even been sensible enough to make sure that he wouldn't be the person who found shizen in his bamboo house. That would after all make him officially linked to the man's Kai deviation. And this way he'd be able to clear out any leftover evidence when shizen was moved to Qiankao to recover. It was perfect and easy and what do you mean shizen is dead? Shizen can't be dead. Shizen is supposed to become nice and gentle to Luo BingGe. Shizen can't be dead. And there were peak lords in the bamboo house going through shizen's things as if they had any right. Luo Bing tried to look, but there was tea on the floor, along with the shards of a sword, and Shizen's beautiful body was stretched out, his hand gripping what must have been a still-burning incense stick. His beautiful hand was blackened with burns. There was a book on the table, as if Shizen had been in the middle of writing something whilst meditating with the incense. But Shizen couldn't be dead. Luo Bing's beautiful gentle Shizen, he'd worked so hard. He'd done everything he could to make Shizen into that kind-hearted Shizen. Shizen couldn't be dead. He couldn't be. Luo Bing. The voice was flat. Hollow. Empty. Luo Bing turned towards the speaker. Yu Qinjuan held the book in his hands, but no, he dropped the book. Yu Qinjuan was holding his drawn sword in his hands. Luo Bing understood. He'd been discovered. But he couldn't fight against Yu Qinjuan. Not without more power. Not without Shinmo. With Shinmo, Luo Bing should be able to do anything. Like bring Shizen back to life. To make him into a kind and gentle Shizen. Luo Bing shouldn't have been able to fail, but he wasn't foolish. He'd set up a talisman just in case he needed to get away, in case someone tried to get between his and his Shizen's love. Shizen wasn't available right now, but with Yu Qinjuan bearing down on him with murderous intent, Luo Bing made the wise choice to cut and run. So he ran. Straight into the endless abyss, the mark on his forehead blazing like a sun. XXX. Yu Qingyi wasn't sure what to think. He'd always hated Shen Qingqiu. Spoiled and underhanded and lazy, the man seemed to revel in his dishonorable conduct, and Liu Qingyi wanted to punch him in the face for it. In that sense, it was strange that news of his death made it feel like someone had pulled the rug out from underneath him. Liu Qingyi didn't really know what to think about Shen Qingqiu being dead. He'd never really wanted the man dead, just to have him stop behaving so inappropriately for his station. Even if his recent string of humiliating losses because of Shen Qingqiu's continued expansion of dishonorable tactics made that dislike more visceral than it had been since they were disciples and expected to get along. There had been several years where they'd barely even seen each other, and those times were for the best. It was frustrating to hear that Shen Qingqiu continued behaving like he did even outside of Liu Qingyi's view. But not having to interact with the man made him far more tolerable. But again, the idea of Shen Qingqiu just dying. It seemed impossible. He was an immortal, wasn't he? What had been doing, lazing about reading pointless books instead of properly cultivating. Useless scum of a man. But then came the news that followed. Of one of Shen Qingqiu's disciples having sabotaged a man's incense in order to try to kill him through a Kai deviation. A disciple that fled from an enraged Yu Qinjuan using some kind of talisman. A disciple who showed himself to be part demon during his escape. A disciple who was heard shouting about some kind of delusion about a warm and gentle Shizen that he would somehow make happen and keep all to himself. On that front, he couldn't even blame Yu Qinjuan for trying to kill the despicably unfilial beast rather than properly investigate if he was truly responsible. He'd practically admitted it in full view of the public, after all. Liu Qingyi was a bit more upset that Yu Qinjuan had actually deigned to draw his never-drawn sword against a disciple when he wouldn't even use it during his rare spars with Liu Qingyi. But again, that all came a distant second to the whatever feelings he was feeling in regards to Shen Qingqiu being dead. What was Liu Qingyi supposed to be feeling right now? XXX. Qingqi was upset. First, there had been the death of an immortal peak lord. Second, there had been Shen Qingqiu's disciple turning out to be a part demon trying to murder the man. Third, when everyone except Yu Qinjuan had calmed down somewhat from that, they found Shen Qingqiu's diary. Or rather, they started actually reading the diary that they'd found. Shen Qingqiu's most recent Kai deviation had apparently impacted his memory. He'd started forgetting important things, faces, names, relationships. But, Shen Qingqiu being his usual prickly self, he'd obviously refused to tell anyone about that. Never mind that Mu Qingfang could probably have fixed a problem in an afternoon. No, the arrogant lecher was the peak lord of Qingjing, obviously he didn't need anyone's help. Regardless, Shen Qingqiu's solution was to simply write everything down. As much as he could remember about his life. And important things like how many grudges he was holding onto, just to make sure that he wouldn't forget to be a spiteful bastard. Qingqi couldn't exactly say that she was surprised, because of course he did that. Heavens forbid that the man get on with his life, instead of constantly trying to find reason to be offended. Except, when Qingqi actually sat down to read the thing purely out of morbid curiosity there was a lot. A lot of it read as simply summarizing cliff notes, less of a voice and more a few concise statements of facts. Born a slave brother Yu Qinjuan, sold to the Q household, Yu Qinjuan, promised to hurry back and free me, waited for over a year, and arranged pretend marriage with Q Haitang that would never happen, Q Jianluo wanted to rape his sister, killed him, burned the Q household, saved Q Haitang, joined Wu Yanzi, ruined my cultivation, found Yu Qinjuan, killed Wu Yanzi. Joined Kang Qiong. The list just kept going. Simple and matter of fact, as if it didn't completely upend everything they knew about him. Shen Qingqiu had been a slave. What? And his history with Yu Qingjuan was because Yu Qingjuan didn't return to free him. There was also a lot of things in there that she had no context for, but considering that it was written for Shen Qingqiu himself, who was also terrified of apparently losing the context of these memories, those moments were few and far in between. It also included wonderful nuggets such as apparently the entire life history of several dozen prostitutes, as well as everything that Shen Qingqiu had done to try to make their lives a little bit better, and how there was always an empty bed for him to sleep in there. As if that made any sense at all, because Shen Qingqiu clearly shouldn't need to be leaving his peak in order to sleep. Actually, digging a bit deeper into that mess left Kai Qingqi feeling distinctly horrified because she'd happily spread rumors about the man's lecherous ways in order to keep her disciples from getting too close to him. Only to find out that he apparently considered the prostitutes as sisters more than anything else and would visit them because managing to help at least them seemed to bring him some kind of reassurance that he wasn't useless and didn't only cause harm to everyone around him. Which was apparently something that Shen Qingqiu had been emotionally struggling with for decades because that's part of what Kai Qingqi had happily told him straight to his face. And she wasn't the only one. The diary described actions that ranged from Yu Qingfang neglecting to send proper aid for injuries on King Jing to Nding explicitly slicing apart their budget. There was even a bit of statistic that showed that the monetary budget for King Jing was barely a fraction of what it had been before they'd become peak lords, whereas the budget for several other peaks had ballooned to ridiculous levels. Not to mention Liu Qingyi interrupting lessons in order to ambush Shen Qingqiu, only to immediately cry foul at Shen Qingqiu for fighting back seemingly regardless of what means he used to do so. And how literally all of the other peaks would happily blame Shen Qingqiu for things that he'd apparently specifically warned them about. As if it was his fault that they hadn't listened to his advice. There was also a bunch of frustrations expressed towards Yu Qingjuan, effectively treating him like a child. Something to indulge, but not something to rely or listen to. Finally culminating in a single notation that Yu Qingjuan would never listen and that he would continue to treat him like a misbehaving pet. Which was honestly, it actually came pretty close to some of the things that Kai Qingqi had seen, in hindsight. And the more she read the more it was blatantly obvious why Shen Qingqiu had rejected the idea of going to Mu Qingfang with his problem without even considering it. He didn't trust any of them because they'd stomped on that trust, spat him in the face, insulted him and innocent people he saw as sisters, and then been offended at him for daring to insult them back. In the eyes of Shen Qingqiu, Mu Qingfang would likely have happily erased more of Shen Qingqiu's memories just to make him easier to deal with. And the fact that Kai Qingqi could look at that assumption and realize that she couldn't actually claim it to be completely ridiculous was. What the hell had they been doing all of these years? XXX. During the years that Zhe Lang spent waiting for Tianlang Jun's body to become viable, Zhe Lang heard a great many things about the funeral. The mortal peak lords were well, immortal. And whilst it was possible that one might die in battle against demons or demonic cultivators, it was generally assumed that someone at that level would inevitably ascend, not die. So the funeral of Shen Qingqiu became quite the talking point among the cultivation world. And Zhe Lang was good at getting into hidden places and listening to gossip. Zhe Lang also had a more personal reason to keep an ear out for mentions of the man's name. Shen Qingqiu had given him the ability to revive his uncle. To free him from his imprisonment after the cultivation sects had so unjustly ambushed him. And it was easy to find rumors about the man because there were a lot of rumors about Shen Qingqiu's death and funeral. Such as his death being the fault of a deliberate murder attempt by one of his own disciples who turned out to be a demon in disguise and who fled Kangkyong through some kind of talisman. But the funeral itself had apparently been quite the spectacle as well. Something about a woman trying to decry Shen Qingqiu as an escaped slave and murderer only to be tossed out on her nose for her ungratefulness at having been saved from a life of incestuous rape. Zhe Lang didn't know the details and he honestly didn't care overly much. Especially considering how busy he became when he realized that Tianlang Jun's new plant body kept deteriorating. Apparently, the sun and moon dew flower was a purely spiritual plant and reacted to demonic Kai as if it was poison. Which was infuriating because Zhe Lang had never heard anything about that. But considering the timing of Shen Qingqiu's death, Zhe Lang was certain that the man had arranged his own death. Zhe Lang didn't know why he'd done so and there was no reason to speculate. What he did know was that if that was the case, then surely Shen Qingqiu, former peak lord of the scholarly peak of Kangkyong, who had clearly investigated the plant for his own sake, would know something about how to fix it. So Zhe Lang went looking. And found him. Or rather, he was found by him. Shen Qingqiu's face was different, his skin paler, and he'd kept such a tight rein on his Kai presence that Zhe Zilang hadn't been able to even guess that he was a cultivator until Shen Qingqiu had greeted him with a hello again, little snake. Apparently, the plant body could be modified to avoid looking too similar to the original body. Which made it a lot easier to remain anonymous, with the drawback of having to wear an unfamiliar face. Shen Qingqiu didn't seem bothered by that at all though, and simply smiled at Zhe Zilang when he hesitantly asked about it. More importantly, upon being told about what had happened to the plant body that Zhe Zilang had prepared for his uncle, Shen Qingqiu gracefully agreed to see if there was anything he could do to help. XXX. His reflection was nostalgic, but even so it wasn't quite the face that he'd once worn. Not that it overly mattered, considering how Orochimaru had spent large portions of his life wearing someone else's face. It was only vaguely reminiscent of Shenju, which was what he'd wanted. He toyed with a few possible new names for himself and had finally settled on Liaoyi. A simple enough name, which could easily imply to discard a leaf, which seemed poetically appropriate. He doubted that he'd manage to actually use it to refer to himself within the next few decades, but it should at least be useful for introducing himself as someone completely unrelated to Shen Qingqiu. Still, he wasn't opposed to helping a polite snake demon who'd apparently managed to find out his former name after their brief encounter. Especially when it promised to be as intriguing as a unique plant body, somehow managing to poison itself with the very same energies that it fed upon. Which was how Shenju was first introduced to Tianlang Jun. The demon lord that the entire cultivation world united against in order to defeat and who they still only ever managed to seal away rather than kill outright. Because apparently that's what Shenju's help towards the snake demon Zhe Zilang had resulted in. Oops. Still, Shenju couldn't really claim that he was overly concerned about it. Tianlang Jun managed to fake politeness well enough, but Shenju could see the hatred festering inside of him very clearly. And even if the man decided to murder all of the cultivators in the world, that would cause some problems for Shenju too. Cultivators were needed to keep people from getting killed by various monsters and spirits, and simply removing them all wholesale would likely result in the near extinction of the human race. Which would be inconvenient. It also wasn't unlikely that Shenju's karma would be negatively affected by having been something of an instigating party in that. And he really didn't want any more negative karma. Which was why Shenju demanded that Tianlang Jun explain to him the entire sequence of events. And then. So, you fell in love with a cultivator, married her, she went back to her sect temporarily, and then suddenly sent you some deceitful letters that led you into an ambush. Shenju stared at the man, feeling more than a bit disgusted. Are you stupid? Tianlang Jun bristled, his demonic eye flaring up only to immediately wince as it deteriorated his body further. She betrayed me. Su Zian, the head disciple of Yuan Hua and infamously favored by the old palace master, went back to her sect to tell the old palace master that she was marrying a demon. Shenju was developing a headache. And you let her? And now you're upset that she sent you some mean letters that were definitely written by her. Did your mother suffocate you as a toddler until your brain stopped developing? Tianlang Jun gritted his teeth. What do you mean? I mean that she was obviously imprisoned within her sect for colluding with demons, and then the old palace master wrote a bunch of letters designed to screw you over. Shenju rubbed his temples. This isn't a complicated scenario. These are the kind of petty little lies that anyone with the vaguest understanding of human nature would be able to see through within an hour. Tianlang Jun's mouth dropped open and he stared at Shenju with wide eyes that were beginning to glisten ominously with tears. You mean my beautiful Su Zian didn't betray me? Shenju sighed. This was going to be a long day. XXX. I still want them dead. Who? The cultivators that conspired against you? The sects that united against a common foe? All cultivators? The regular humans who'd inevitably go extinct without the monster-slaying support of their cultivators? Tianlang Jun glared at him. The sects? Shenju tilted his head. Why? They turned on me and left Su Zian to die. They listened to a fellow cultivator who cried wolf. Shenju corrected absently. As long as the cultivator making the claim has the slightest bit of presumed integrity, a human will always be believed over a demon. That's simply human nature. It won't change even if you kill and replace those sects 1,000 times over. Tianlang Jun stared at him, stunned for a moment, before recovering. Then I'll just stop new sects from forming. How? Shenju raised an eyebrow at him. The sects formed because they were needed. A power vacuum existed and organized cultivators were required. Shenju shook his head. If you want to do away with the sects, you'll have to do away with all cultivators and by extension all of the humans that they begrudgingly protect. Tianlang Jun stared at him for another long moment before cursing and turning on his heel in order to storm back out. Leaving Shenju to his Kai experiments. XXX. I was a fascinating thing. and also absurd and likely incredibly misunderstood. Sunlight produced Yang Kai, and yet moonlight produced Yin Kai. This despite the fact that the only difference between moonlight and sunlight was the slight phase shift that came about from the sun's rays reflecting off of the moon's surface. By all accounts, this meant that there was no actual difference between Yang and Yin. Kai was Kai, and the different elements related to it were honestly, chakra was probably an easy comparison. There were people with fire nature chakra who had a very easy time learning fire ninjutsu, but even they could start spitting out water ninjutsu if they were willing to expend the effort. It'd be extremely inefficient, but it was also not really a complicated process. You just artificially shifted the chakra into a different form than what came naturally to you. In that sense, the difference between spiritual Kai and demonic Kai would be Shenju honestly didn't really know how to describe it. A human couldn't produce demonic Kai, and a demon couldn't produce spiritual Kai. There wasn't really a comparison with chakra that actually worked. Unless you wanted to lean on bloodline limits, but that was still just chakra. Having said that, Tianlang Jun's new body made no sense at all. The sun and moon dew flower had created a body molded around the demon's Kai, and yet it deteriorated from that very Kai. It'd be like saying that a flower relied on the sun, but that it would immediately wither during the day. Well, no. In a regular flower, that could be explained by it not having been evolved for a specific environment. A flower designed to survive on the forest floor under a thick canopy would naturally wither away if placed in the middle of a blazing desert. No, it was more as if the flower had adapted to producing a poison that immediately killed itself. Just how? How did that make any sense at all? He must be missing something about the differences between spiritual and demonic Kai. Or was? Shenju paused, then sent his Kai into Tianlang Jun's body again, cataloging what it could find. It was. The plant body had effectively given itself an autoimmune disorder. It was classifying parts of itself as dangerous and attacking it, withering the body as a side effect. So, all that Shenju needed to do was convince the plant body that demonic Kai wasn't dangerous. Huh. Well, if his forays into doing much the same for chakra implants carried over into this field too, then this should take him maybe an hour. Too bad, he'd been enjoying having a volunteer to experiment on. XXX. Shenju didn't really mind Tianlang Jun using his new healthy body to murder the old palace master. Certainly, it was possible that being so adjacent to a murder would affect Shenju's karma negatively, but well, the man had imprisoned Tianlang Jun and murdered both his wife and his unborn child. If anything, Tianlang Jun murdering the man in retaliation and possibly cutting a bloody swathe through the Huanhua that supported him was also a form of karma. It was also interesting to see how Tianlang Jun's beliefs of vengeance differed so thoroughly from the Avenger that was honestly, that boy had probably been his favorite student in any of his lifetimes. And not only because Orochimaru had managed to dodge most all of the consequences of his own actions by temporarily allying himself with the boy. He'd also been clever, driven, and had somehow managed to dodge the pitfall that was how ideologically boring Orochimaru's usually fanatical minions tended to become. Oh, Uchiha Sasuke had been plenty annoying in his own way, but there was a certain level of amused delight in finding that he'd once again managed to not kill someone. A ninja with a code against killing, how mind-bogglingly silly. Especially considering how dedicated he was to kill the person responsible for the deaths of his family. Yes, there was admittedly not a great deal of competition for the title of best student in his current life, considering the level of completing competence involved. But there honestly wasn't a lot of competition even in his former life. It was really hard to be proud of someone who spent most of their time on their knees, simpering about how much of a wonderful genius Orochimaru was. And then there was Luo BingGe, who was probably easily his most detested student in both lives. Shenju grimaced slightly at the thought of those covetous eyes. He'd heard from Zhe Lang that Luo BingGe had turned out to be a part demon who'd fled from the sect when Shenju had framed him for his death, and that really didn't make it any better. Creepy little bastard should just drop dead somewhere. XXX. Liu Qinjuan received a call for help from Huanhua Palace. The demon was attacking them. In fact, a very well-known demon was attacking them. Tianlang Jun, freed from his imprisonment. Tianlang Jun, who had required all of the sects to work together in order to so much as scratch him and who'd been planning to declare war on all of humanity. Now free to roam the world. Suddenly, the memory of two faces overlapped in Liu Qinjuan's mind. The same mark on their foreheads, the same half-maddened expression. Of course. That's where he'd run off to. Luo BingGe had killed his own Shizen and then used all of the knowledge from King Jing's impressive library to free his father. That accursed demon spawn. Liu Qinjuan was already on his travel sword before he called out to the other peak lords that they were rushing to Huanhua's aid. Because surely, the father would know where the son had ran off to afterwards, no? XXX. Initially, Tianlang Jun had just wanted to kill all humans. His wife, his beautiful wife, had betrayed him. Surely that meant that the rest of humanity didn't deserve to live, right? Except, then he talked to Shen Zhu and all of those thoughts fell apart. The old palace master of Yuanhua had deceived him into believing that his beautiful wife had betrayed him. Such a convoluted but it made sense, it fit with everything, and it filled Tianlang Jun with equal parts hatred and shame. Shame that he'd ever doubt the feelings of his beautiful and cold wife. Shame that he'd believe some old man about where her loyalties actually lay. And really, listening to Shen Zhu as the man amused himself with trying to cure Tianlang Jun's incurable condition, humans were fascinating, weren't they? To try and save the life of an enemy of humanity, not even because it would be the righteous thing to do, but simply because it was a way to keep himself entertained. What an absolutely horrid specimen of humanity. And yet, the man had a spine of steel and a moral code that was it was hilariously warped, but it was also refusing to budge even an inch. And then the crazy bastard actually cured him. Oh, the plant body wasn't as inherently resilient as his demon body. But it was also a lot more malleable. Capable of adapting to his Kai in a way that made him wonder if he could simply transform into a giant snake and swallow the entirety of Yuanhua Palace whole. Tianlang Jun wasn't going to do that. Both because he didn't really have any desire to become a giant snake, but also because he wanted the old palace master to know exactly who was coming to kill him. But with his new body, and with the element of surprise on his side this time around, he barely even needed to kill any of the Yuanhua cultivators. He just went in, shattered their many anti-demon arrays, and then started ripping off the old palace master's limbs. It was honestly very cathartic. That said, he'd known from the start that it was a suicide attack. So he made sure that the old palace master was well and truly dead, and then he went out to greet the sects that Yuanhua had no doubt called in to aid them. Tianlang Jun was satisfied. His wife and child were dead. Their killer was also dead. What did Tianlang Jun have to keep him alive? Even so, these were the same sects who'd sided with the old palace master and imprisoned him. If he was going to die, he might as well go out tearing a bloody swathe through their ranks. For all of the years that he'd lost, hating his beautiful wife for a betrayal that she'd never committed. And wouldn't you know, there came that cultivator with that powerful sword. It was your fault. And there the cultivator was launched into a mountainside as another form emerged from a portal in the air. What? I was going to have a beautiful and gentle Shizen, but you ruined it. The new arrival screamed, swinging his sword. Wait, was that Shinmo? The legendary super evil sword that turned demons into frothing madmen. What the hell was going on? Luo Bing. The cultivator answered with a roar. You accursed bastard. I will rip out your entrails through your nose. Tianlang Jun leaned back, a little bit surprised at the vitriol. He remembered that cultivator as being very serious, but largely hollow when it came to actual anger or hatred. And yet here he was, flooding their surroundings with bloodthirst as he tried to kill the wielder of Shinmo. Wasn't this supposed to be Tianlang Jun's final moments? Why were these two people stealing the show with their grudge match? Get a room. Tianlang Jun glanced at the other sects as they arrived, and they were only paying attention to this Luo Bing person and the angry cultivator. They weren't even looking at Tianlang Jun. It was like his adrenaline was just seeping out into the sand. Like expensive wine, ruthlessly dumped out into the dirt. What was there even a reason for Tianlang Jun to be here anymore? Tianlang Jun stared as the two people continued fighting, bloodthirst and hatred and insults and impressively flashy Kai attacks raining down around them. Maybe he should just go back to Zhuzilang. Find a decent book to read. Finally decided, Tianlang Jun turned around and walked away. Nobody even noticed him leaving. XXX. Of course Shen Zhu didn't see the battle against Tianlang Jun. He had no interest of becoming involved in a fight like that, and seeing as he was a cultivator, arriving in time to the battle would mean that failing to help would instantly label him as a traitor to humanity. Shen Zhu was quite satisfied with his new life as a rogue cultivator and didn't really have any desire to spend the rest of his long life, he was practically immortal after all, running from the other sects. So he very deliberately didn't show up to see the battle. However, by the time he arrived, quite a few things were different from what he'd expected. Firstly, there was no Tianlang Jun. Secondly, the only wounded seemed to be from collateral damage more than anything else. Thirdly, Yu Qinjuan was surrounded by the other peak lords, slowly bleeding out whilst moaning about how he'd avenged his Xiaoju. Fourthly, Luo Bing's corpse was there. Fifthly, a sword was embedded blade first into the ground, leaking a malicious miasma that the other cultivators were now desperately attempting to contain. Shen Zhu blinked, then asked another cultivator about what exactly had happened. And apparently that was Luo Bing's new sword. And Yu Qinjuan had pretty much killed himself to defeat the part demon. But nobody really seemed to be able to contain the sword's miasma, so the sect leaders had started talking about where they could throw it away. The eternal abyss seemed to be the general consensus, but a lot of people were worried that some other demon might stumble across it and become just as terrifyingly powerful as Luo Bing had apparently been. Shen Ju sighed, but went off to see if he could at least help purify the miasma. Purification rites weren't exactly his specialty, but he could at least help by absorbing and converting the malicious Kai into something less likely to cause problems. It was basically just a slightly more advanced form of meditation, after all. Said and done, Shen Ju settled in at an appropriate distance and started to meditate. Slowly taking the miasma into himself and then diluting it with his own Kai until it dissolved. It wasn't exactly complicated, but it was delicate and finicky, so Shen Ju wasn't quite sure how much time was passing. Maybe an hour, maybe a day. The Kai came easily as he opened a path for it and then dissolved smoothly into his core as his own Kai diluted it. It was just a bit of phase shifting. Same as what happened as the sunlight reflected off of the moon. But to have a spirit powerful enough to create a visible miasma like that, Shen Ju couldn't help but wonder where the sword might have come from, how old it might be, what horrors it might have borne witness to and participated in. Finally, the malicious Kai started to thin, evaporating like mist during a summer day. And so Shen Ju opened his eyes and rose to his feet. There were people staring at him with open mouths, as if they'd never seen something as simple as purification meditation before, but Shen Ju wasn't really paying attention to them. No, he was looking at the sword. Its Kai felt almost familiar after the time he'd spent meditating with it, but even so. Shen Ju walked up to the sword and reached out to grab its hilt. It purred underneath his hand, familiar and warm and satisfied like a snake on a sun-warmed boulder. Shen Ju pulled it out of the earth, staring as its still shining and never dulling edge caught the sunlight. Different and yet so achingly familiar. He felt his lips tug into an involuntary smile. What have you been up to, Kusanagi? Thanks for watch here.